Hello, my name's Ruth Weir and I'm going to talk to you today about my research on whether we can predict domestic abuse. So first of all, a bit of background about how I've come to be doing this research. I started off life as a geographer actually, so my first degree was in geography, and it was after this I got into a job with Suffolk County Council where I was doing research on crime and particularly on crime mapping. So it was during this time when I was looking at crime mapping that I decided to go back to do my master's, which is in geographical information science. Following on from this, I was lucky to be given the opportunity to go and work for the Home Office as a GIS specialist in their Research, Development and Statistics Directorate. And I continued to develop lots of different crime mapping techniques. Which then subsequently I went on to work in local government in various research and intelligence roles. And my final role was with Essex County Council, where I was looking at domestic abuse in Essex as a multi-agency project. And it was during this project that I started to think about how little we know about those who don't report their abuse to the police. And I made an application to do my PhD here at University of Essex. And I have, since then I've been here for what must have now been nearly 5 years, and I'm in the final stages of my PhD, where I'm using GIS to look at domestic abuse. The reason that I've chosen this subject is because of the enormous societal impact that domestic abuse has, not only on the victims but also on their families. 2 women a week die as a result of their abuse, and the cost to society and the economy is estimated to be in the region of £15.7 million a year. Domestic abuse is one of the most underreported crimes, along with crimes such as rape and sexual offences. And there are certain groups that are thought to be less likely to report their abuse to the police. And these groups include men, those with disabilities, and certain ethnic groups. But we don't really know whether the profile of those who do and don't report to the police is the same. So this research sets out to look into that in more detail. The reason for my focus on Essex is that the Independent Police Complaints Commission criticised Essex Police for their handling of 4 recent domestic homicide cases. And this has led to a multi-agency approach to domestic abuse in Essex, particularly influenced by the pilot that was run from DCLG, which enabled multi-agencies to work together to try and look at domestic abuse. So these agencies included the police, the local authority, probation service and voluntary sector organisations. This slide will show you the definition of domestic abuse that I will be using in this research. It's the Home Office definition, but the data that I've been using predates the additional coercive control legislation that was brought in 2015. But if you read this definition here, you can see what I'm looking at. The research has 2 policy questions and 1 academic question. The first policy questions look at where Essex County Council should focus their resources and services to have the most impact in reducing domestic abuse. And the second question looks at whether Essex County Council can rely on Essex Police data to predict the service requirements of those who do not report their abuse to the police. And the academic question is looking at whether individual or neighbourhood variables are a better predictor of domestic abuse. The research is framed around a conceptual model that looks at the individual, social and ecological reasons that domestic abuse takes place. First of all, there is the individual level where individual attitudes, behaviours, health and social history are considered. This is the area where most research has been done at present. Then you get the interpersonal and family layer, where you look at things like family relationships, the existence of patriarchal culture, the role of women, whether people are using alcohol and drugs, and whether there are issues such as poverty and employment. The next level up is the interpersonal and family layer, where we look at things like family relationships, the role of patriarchal culture, the role of women, whether people are using alcohol and drugs, and things such as poverty and employment. And so the individual and the interpersonal and the family are nested within the neighbourhood and the community where the individuals live. So here, this is research that hasn't really been done at all in the UK before, and there's some small amount of research in the US. But here we're looking at things like the neighbourhood environment, whether there's a culture of violence within that neighbourhood, what the access to services is like, and the quality of housing, and whether there's drug use and things like social isolation. And all of these layers are nested within the policy and society, and this is the area that I want to challenge in this research by looking at the 3 layers underneath. Now, this first map shows you a map of the rate of domestic abuse at the lower super output area, which is Census Geography. The map shows the hot and cold spots of domestic abuse in Essex. What can be seen is the red areas are areas which are statistically significant hotspots, so areas where there are higher concentrations of domestic abuse. And you can see these hotspots in Colchester, Clacton, Southend-on-Sea, Thurrock and Harlow. And the other areas, the areas in the darker blue, they're statistically significant cold spots, so areas where there's a lot less abuse. So what my research has done is started to model some of the predictors of domestic abuse at the neighbourhood level. So this is looking at about 1,500 people in every lower super output area. So to model the domestic abuse rate in a lower super output area, I've included a number of different variables and tested them based on social disorganisation theory. And these are the rate of antisocial behaviour, the percentage of black and minority ethnic population, young people who are aged between 15 and 24, so the percentage, the population density, the rate of burglary in an area, the criminal damage rate, the indices of multiple deprivation from 2015 and disaggregated into their separate indices, and the distance to services such as A&E. As an example, I'll talk you through the relationship between antisocial behaviour and domestic abuse. So this map here, this shows you the rate of domestic abuse in Essex. And as you can see, the red areas are the areas where there's hotspots or higher rates of domestic abuse, and the yellow areas are much lower levels of abuse. So if you then look at the next slide, which is the rate of police reported antisocial behaviour in Essex, you can see that the relationship is very similar, with the exception of the red area, which is in the middle of Uttlesford, which is Stansted Airport. Normally when you want to look at a relationship between variables, you'd use something like an ordinary least squared regression. The method that I've used, geographically weighted regression, is based around Tobler's first law of geography that states that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. So basically this gives you a method that creates greater weighting to nearby data, and it allows you to look at how relationships between variables vary geographically. So in policy terms, this allows you to enable much more localised policy responses, rather than just using a blanket approach, which may work in some areas but not in others. So you're looking, in effect, at the relationship between variables and how that relationship varies over space. So in this next map, you can see the standard residuals in the neighbourhood model. So with antisocial behaviour, it explains 64% of the variability in the data set. And these are the standard residuals, so you can see where the model overestimates, which are the blue areas, and those areas where it underestimates. So we've talked about the antisocial behaviour rate, but when you start to add in other variables to the model, the best fit in the model is found by looking at the antisocial behaviour rate, the proportion of black and minority ethnic populations, the proportion of young people aged 15 to 24, the population density, and then there are 4 variables from the index of multiple deprivation. So these are the income score, the health score, the barrier score, and the living environment score. And these increase the R-squared value to 0.81. So this is then explaining 81% of the variability in the model. The benefit of this type of modelling is you can look at the individual coefficient variables and how they vary over space. This next map, which looks slightly like a dodgy photocopy, shows you how the influence of the antisocial behaviour rate on the domestic abuse rate varies across Essex. So the whiter areas are areas where the coefficient values are higher, so the influence of antisocial behaviour, the influence that it plays on domestic abuse rate is greater. So in terms of policy interventions, it may be that you'd rather focus on Colchester and tendering and look at an intervention around antisocial behaviour than looking in an area to the south where the influence of antisocial behaviour is lower. The next map again breaks down the coefficient variables, and this one is about income. So you can see that the influence of income is much higher in the Braintree district, which is in the middle at the top, and then lower in an area quite nearby in Chelmsford. So it does show how a targeted intervention could really work in these areas rather than looking at the whole area. And on this final map, you can look at how the overall model varies across space. So the local R-square value is plotted for the whole of Essex, and you can see that the R-square value is lower in the middle of Essex, but higher in the south. So the model actually fits better in the south of the county. So that was a very quick overview of the spatial analysis that I've done and the model that I've produced at the neighbourhood level. The next steps in my research are I've just completed a community asset mapping exercise where I've actually visited some of the areas where the model either under predicts, over predicts, or accurately predicts, to see whether there's something going on within the community that's such as collective efficacy that's influencing the amount of abuse that's either reported or actually occurring within the neighbourhood. And I've had some interesting findings on this, such as things like the influence of churches in an area and community centres, and the fact that in some areas people are being actively encouraged to report to different agencies. Another thing that I'm doing is looking at the individual level predictors, so going back to looking at things like age, gender and ethnicity and family relationships. So if you think back to that conceptual model, I'm trying to look at the first two tiers to fill in with this neighbourhood tier. And beyond my PhD, my future research, I would like to be able to test this model nationally and also to be able to bring in other data sets. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find other data within Essex, which has been able to be shared with me. But other areas of the country have said that they can give me data around housing and the NHS. So it would be good to test this data to see whether people who report to the police are the same in profile as those who report to other agencies. And I'd also like to explore other agencies, things like I found in the community asset mapping, such as the influences of churches. So the expected outcomes from my research are that I really want to challenge the current practice that we rely on police data, and at the moment we don't actually know about 80% potentially of victims, and we're making this assumption that victims are the same in profile as those who do report to the police. So I want to improve this understanding of the underreporting and look at the true extent of the problem. And in doing this, I'm uncovering some of the more root causes of domestic abuse, which I hope will enable policymakers and agencies to plan appropriate reporting mechanisms, services, support, pathways, preventative measures and intervention points for victims. I'm sorry that I couldn't be here with you today, but I do hope that you found the presentation interesting. And if you do have any questions, then here are my contact details. Thank you very much.